They can do better than this. Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing something just a little bit different. I recently just finished A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is a collection of 3 novellas that George R.R. Martin has written that take place about 100 or 90 years before the events of A Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, however you want to call it. And I didn't really have enough to say to do a full review for it. My quick review is they're fun. I like them. I mean, they're novellas, so in general, I think novellas are always just okay. I don't think they're ever really anything all that amazing. But this just got greenlit to be a new series at HBO. And I really think that this has a chance of being the best Westeros-inspired adaptation that there has been so far. Now, for any adaptation, that's a very, very lofty claim, first of all. But I think to make a good adaptation, there are a couple things that need to happen. I think you need to honor the source material. Personally, I would love to see page-by-page adaptations of certain things. I was really hopeful that we would get a very faithful adaptation of The Wheel of Time, and that's definitely not what happened. But also, you can look at something like Dune. That isn't a 100% page-for-page adaptation, but I think it was a very well-done story that stayed true to most of the source material. And I think that's always a super, super important thing. Now, this is another thing that I think matters, and it is having a decent budget. And I think with HBO's success around a lot of Westeros shows, that this should have it. Bad CGI and a low budget can make things feel and look smaller and not as grand as they should be, especially in certain kind of adaptations, especially when it comes to things like science fiction and fantasy. And I think they also need to make sure that they have somebody who really knows the source material. And that doesn't have to be George. I think he is supposed to be a part of it in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just a producer credit. But I think having somebody there who's directing on site every day, who kind of knows the world, and when something feels really out of place, they're able to say, hey, we need to tweak that, we need to change that. That's not something someone would say or do. And having somebody like that around is also really important to any adaptation. And the last thing kind of goes hand in hand with that. It is good writing. You cannot have a good show without good writing and direction, like I just said. And so I'm hoping that the writer strike doesn't affect this show too much. I don't know if it really is anything further along than they have just gotten a yes, that it is something that they want to do and are going to go ahead and do it. Now, obviously, we can't talk about Game of Thrones adaptations without talking about A Game of Thrones. And, I think that is a really good adaptation. I know a lot of people do not like the last 2 seasons in particular, and I can agree that the writing and, just the whole pace of the show definitely failed to meet the expectations that were set up beforehand. And, I actually only just recently watched the entire series all the way through in the past year. And I think the build-up to the last 2 seasons and people having to wait week to week to get them definitely played a big part into how much people hated the ending. I don't think it was a perfect ending by any means. And so I think it's pretty easy to say that this Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, A Hedge Knight, could definitely be a better adaptation. You can also look at the early seasons of Game of Thrones. They're not perfect either. The budget obviously wasn't there like it was in the later seasons. And so the fact that you have that mixture of a great story, low budget, you can feel it when Robert shows up to Winterfell in the first couple episodes. It's well done, but I don't know, I feel like it should have been grander. And you see some of those things later on, especially when you look at certain weddings or events, just the scale, the amount of people, the costuming, it all just takes a step up. And that also brings me to the other adaptation, which is A House of Dragons. This might be a hot take, but I think the first season of The House of the Dragon was better than any season of Game of Thrones. I don't know if that's recency bias. I don't know if it's because the budget was so much better that, we got to see things on the scale that they're supposed to be, between the dragons, all kinds of costuming, everything, the castles, everything just looks amazing. And so that is all really positive. So how is that not going to be the best adaptation? Well, one, I think it is going to be affected by the current writer strike. From what I've read and heard, currently the script has been written, they're good to go, they're going to start filming, but they're not going to have writers on site to make changes, to do any of those things that can really make something special. You might get to the scene or to the site and run through something and it just isn't working. And I'm worried that they're not going to have people on site to make the necessary changes to keep the same quality that they had in the first season. Also, another thing is that is a very focused story. And what I mean by that is it really follows a few families, and it's really like an interpersonal, inter-family struggle that obviously has wide-reaching effect on the whole country. But, you know, I think it's going to be very narrowed in. I did read Fire and Blood, so I mean, I know what happens, and I know it involves a lot of people, but it also, I think, is just very, very focused on one thing. And that's fine. That's not necessarily a negative, but I think it is a certain kind of way to tell a story. I also think the tone between House of the Dragon and A Game of Thrones is very similar. It's very dark, very gritty, and while a lot of people do like that, you know, it might not be the worst thing to have a slight change of pace. So why do I think specifically that A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, A Hedge Knight, could be the best adaptation we have seen? And I already kind of alluded to it, but I really think it could have a much different tone than the other two adaptations we've gotten from this universe. I don't think it needs to be as dark and gritty as the other two. Now it can, but it doesn't have to. And I think them having that creative freedom to kind of be a little bit more playful, have some more levity, not be so serious and dark, is going to be a good thing for the show. And it's something that I personally would like to see. When I was reading it, I just felt slightly different. The stakes didn't feel as high. I mean, there are definitely big stakes and everything, but I don't know, the whole tone of it felt different from when I read Fire and Blood and A Song of Ice and Fire. And I think that's a huge positive for this show going forward, that it can be its own thing. It's not going to be in the shadow as much, because it's going to feel like a very different universe, even though it's taking place in the same, you know, universe. With that being said, I also think that the character we would be following in this story is so different from any other character we've followed. You know, the other two adaptations are very much focused on high princes, you know, kings, queens, very political. And I don't think that this show has to focus on that as much. Yes, they are going to have to involve the Targaryens, obviously. But I think the freedom that they'll have in exploring things through Duncan instead of, you know, Jon Snow or Dany or any of those characters, I think it's just going to give it a different opportunity. I think we're going to be able to see things that we didn't. I'm thinking about how we saw Flea Bottom when in House of the Dragon, when they sneak out and they're in the city and they're going through all this crazy stuff. And I think we can get more of the small folk story than we do of like the huge knights, you know, massive battles, all of that. I think we can get a much different kind of story using him as our focal point to view the story through. And I think that's a huge positive, because I don't need another, you know, epic fantasy following a king or, you know, something like that. I could definitely use something that maybe even builds up to something bigger. I do know, you know, what happens to these characters, but the build up to where they finally end up, I think, would be a great thing. And they could do a lot of like smaller, I don't want to say monster of the weeky kind of stuff, but I think they could, if they wanted to go that route. They could really just kind of just them be out there going from tavern to tavern, exploring and getting to see pieces and parts of Westeros that we never saw before. And I have kind of alluded to this last point I want to make, but I will say it again. The freedom they will have with these characters is going to be something completely different than they definitely had in A Game of Thrones, and even more than they have in House of the Dragon. In House of the Dragon, you know, we have the general plot threads that we know are going to happen. Currently, with this, we do know where these characters end, but the story of getting to there is very small. There's only been 3 novellas written with these characters, and even inside of those novellas, there are huge time skips and huge things that happen in between that they reference that hasn't even been written yet. It would be great to see some of those things on the screen, and I think, you know, that freedom is both a blessing and a curse. I know George R.R. Martin has said in different interviews he either wants to write a total of 6 or 12 of these novellas following these characters. I think it's unlikely we get any of those. I am in the camp that we will get Winds of Winter, but not the final book that I can never remember the name of. A Promise of Summer, A Song of Summer, a Song of Spring, something like that. I can never remember, but I don't think we get that book or any more of these novellas. And so I think we can get really creative and interesting stories that aren't just from George's mind. Now, I think it's pretty clear that George obviously is a master of his own universe, and he has been pretty unparalleled when coming up with stories, but I don't think it's a bad thing to give writers freedom, especially if they have just enough freedom where they have to stay inside the rails. They can't go too crazy, but they have enough flexibility to really like tell interesting stories. And that is something I would love to see. I would love for this to be a slightly more lighthearted, funny, kind of, I don't want to say comical, because that definitely wouldn't fit in this world, but it doesn't need to be high politics, high drama all the time. I would love to just see an episode of them, you know, like running through the woods, doing something dumb, and just having a good time. I think that would be a great kind of episode. But let me know if you think I'm just crazy and that this will be a horrible adaptation. If you have no faith in HBO, which I can totally understand after the last 2 seasons of A Game of Thrones, I totally get it. But let me know down in the comments on what you think, and have a good one.